It's been a difficult week in our community. When you experience any kind of loss, it's difficult. But some losses just hit even harder than others. When a young boy like Malachi loses his life so young, even before it even seems to be getting started, and so suddenly, that's the kind of loss that could just devastate a family and send just shock waves of grief and pain through a community. And so I've been doing some grieving on my own these past few days, just kind of sitting in the pain and the shock and the grief of that, and doing what I can to kind of collect all of my Malachi memories. That's kind of what we do when we grieve. We try to cling to those memories. We talk to other people what do you remember? And Kim and I were doing some reminiscing this week, and one of our favorite Malachi memories was last summer when we were having an event up in Denver, in the city park in Denver, and we were just having fun on a Sabbath afternoon with a Denver site. And Tasha got a little out of hand, and she fell down and really hurt her wrist and had to go to the ER with Adam and the kids. And Malachi was there with Tasha and Adam's girls, his cousins, Lily and Melody. They're all at the hospital, and we're kind of checking in on them, making sure everything's okay. And it looked like Tasha broke her wrist pretty bad. She was going to be there a while. And so Kim and I said, hey, let us come pick the kids up. We'll take them home. You guys take your time, and whether they spend the night or you come pick them up later. And so we went and we got the kids, and it was Malachi and Lily and Melody. And for the next 3 or 4 hours, they had Kim and I in stitches. These kids are so funny, just their banter between us and the questions they were asking us, and the way they were kind of trashing my car, what kind of car is this? And you call that turbo and stuff like that. And when we got to the house, we just sat around the kitchen table, and they hadn't eaten in a while, so we started feeding them piles of quesadillas and macaroni and cheese and other food that kids like, and we just sat around the table, and we just talked, and it's like they're these little adults that were just telling us about their lives and their hopes and their dreams. That was such a good memory. And the last time I saw Malachi was 2 months ago at another tragic gathering, the memorial service of Arthur Olande, and I saw just Malachi and Isaiah sitting on the couch, and they had their devices out, and they were kind of having a conversation. I went and I just inserted myself between them and just said, I'm going to talk with you guys. And they were so hospitable, and they just welcomed me into their conversation. And for the next 10 or 15 minutes, we just sat and talked like a couple of guys. And then, things just kind of pulled us away to other things. When tragedies like this happen, when things that don't seem to make any kind of sense, we see the pain immediately. We feel the pain immediately. If you've gone through loss, you know what I'm talking about. And that's as it should be. Mature people, healthy people grieve. And grief means you don't brush past the pain, but you stay in it as long as necessary to gain from it the healing that you need. You don't rush out of pain, you stay in it. But the thing that I think Craig was alluding to in his video is that there are not only long-term benefits to grief and pain, but there are immediate benefits that can come out of horrific and senseless losses like this. For instance, loss like this brings a tremendous focus to life and love and relationships. Things that before seemed so important that may have divided us or caused friction between us, all of a sudden that doesn't matter anymore. And we just want to be with the people that are around us, that we love, pull our kids in a little tighter, just really focus on love and relationship. That's one immediate benefit to grief. Another potential benefit is the perspective it brings to us, one that we rarely have, and that is, as has already been mentioned this morning, just the brevity of life, how it's so fragile. Again, these are things that we don't typically talk about, and as a result, we could easily just kind of go through life kind of just taking people around us and time and things for granted. Have you ever noticed how we kind of process our mortality differently at different ages and different life stages? Right? When we are young, we never think about mortality. Chances are, if you're under 20, you're wondering what that word means, right? Because when we're young, we don't think about death or dying. We don't think it applies to us. If we tell the truth, we don't think we will ever die. We think we are invincible. We are immortal. We are unbreakable. But then, we start putting on years, and we start having experiences, and we start experiencing loss, or the people around us experience loss, or people that we know die. And maybe at first we kind of reason to ourselves that, that makes sense because they're older than I am. They should die. But then as we continue to go, then people younger than us die. And then that really rocks us to the core, because then we start to realize that how fragile life is, and that this mortality thing might actually apply to me too. And we have these brushes with death, as we kind of go through life, things that happen to us, maybe 2 seconds later there, or 2 more steps to the right there, and we realize we may have been gone. Life is fragile. We realize, I am going to die. You are going to die. Everyone you love is going to die, and that knowledge can bring incredible focus to life. I think that's why the Bible says, it tells us to number our days. In other words, realize how many days you have and that they are short. Because when you live with that perspective, you live better. You live with incredible focus, and you appreciate the people around you. But what do we do with this mortality thing? What do we do with the mortality of our loved ones? What hope do we have when death comes knocking at our door? What comforts you? What gives you hope when you find yourself, as many people do right now, in the valley of the shadow of death? All summer long we've been in a series called What We Believe, and we've been looking at these foundational beliefs of Christians and of Seventh-day Adventists, things that give us an anchor and a sense of hope and direction and identity and cohesion. And we've been asking the question, what difference do these beliefs make in my day-to-day life? I mean, how do I apply this? What usefulness does this belief have to me? And because of the events this week, I thought it would be wise to maybe change the order of the beliefs we're covering. And so today, rather than talking about spiritual gifts, we're going to be looking at our answer to this ultimate question. What happens when I die? What happens when we die? Is there hope beyond the grave? Is there answer to this problem of my mortality? Now, if you've been with us all summer, you know that we've already been putting these questions into some context. If you haven't been here, please go back on our website. You can find previous messages where several weeks ago we covered the topic of sin and evil in our world and why it's here through the context of this thing we call the great controversy. And then the next week we looked at what Jesus and what God has done to remedy this problem, and we saw that in how we're saved by grace through faith. And again, we need to understand these things to really put these big questions into context and to understand where we're going today. And so I would encourage you to go back and look at those. But what happens after we die? And to answer those questions, I want to take us to one story in the life of Jesus. And it's a situation that's similar to our own. There was a tragic and an unexpected death of a man who died far too early. And there is a family and a community that is left in shock and in grief and asking really hard questions. John 11 tells the story of the death of one of Jesus' closest friends, Lazarus. And we're going to read through the story, and we're going to kind of stop along the way, and we're going to find answers to these questions of death, and focus particularly not on death, but also on, more importantly, resurrection. And let me just say that in again, just the atmosphere of where our community is right now, that this topic has the potential to come across as, or be felt as, somewhat insensitive. I have been at funerals where pastors have kind of taught on our belief of what happens when we die, for instance. And it just seemed like the timing wasn't just right for that. But I just want to remind you that this is not a funeral, that this is a sermon series called What We Believe. And so we'll be looking at what we believe happens when we die, but again, more importantly, what we believe about the resurrection. And I'm going to do that as sensitively as possible. Chances are I won't be perfect, but let's begin. John chapter 11, verse 1. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. If you've been to Jerusalem, stood on the Mount of Olives, overlooking Jerusalem, Bethany is just on the backside of the Mount of Olives, just like a mile and a half from the walls of Jerusalem. This is where Mary and Martha and Lazarus lived. Now, Jesus at the time is up north in Galilee because the people in Jerusalem wanted to kill him. So he was kind of up there. And so that's why he was not in Bethany. So the sisters sent word to Jesus up north, "Lord, the one you love is sick." When Jesus heard this, he said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." I've got that one line kind of highlighted. I want you to tuck that away because we're going to come back to that later. This sickness will not end in death. Remember that. Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, so when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. I want you to remember that as well. That he got this message that Lazarus is sick. It's not going to end in death. That's the first thing we're remembering. The second thing we're remembering is Jesus stayed where he was 2 more days. After he had said this, he went on to tell them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up." His disciples replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better." Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So then he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. And for your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe." So the first thing that Jesus teaches regarding death, that in my opinion is good news, is that death, according to Jesus, is similar to the state of being asleep. Jesus said, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep." And they think he's talking about natural sleep. And he's like, no. He's died. Death, according to Jesus, is like sleep. And this is not only a teaching of Jesus, this is something that Adventists and other Christians believe is a teaching of the entire Bible. That in the Old Testament, the New Testament, that death is compared to most often sleep. Over 50 times in the New Testament, the authors of the New Testament use sleep as a metaphor for death. And I understand that much of the world, and perhaps you, believe something very different, that death is a state of consciousness, that when we die, we maintain our consciousness, and that we immediately go to either heaven or that not so positive alternative. And you may believe that's what death is like, and you may have come here believing that, and that's okay, because we're not saved by what we believe, what happens to us when we die, right? We are saved by the work of Jesus, as we covered a few weeks ago. But Jesus taught that death is like sleep. And you may wonder, well, why do I say that's good news? How could that how is that good news? Well, one reason is good news is because who doesn't like sleep? Ask any of our young mothers who have little babies, and fathers too, whether they would like just a good night of sleep. And they'll say, "Sign me up for that." We value a good night of sleep. It is so important to us. You know those nights when you laid your head on the pillow and the very next thing you know, it's like morning and you're like, "That was awesome. I slept great," right? When we spend times together in places and we wake up together, maybe we're at a family gathering or whatever, what's the first thing we ask ourselves in the morning? Each other. How did you sleep? Why do we care? Why would we ask that question if we didn't care about sleep? Now, if someone answers, "I slept great, I slept like a log or like a baby," we're like, "Good news," right? But, "I didn't sleep so well." "Oh, I'm sorry," right? We value sleep. And Jesus is telling us is that death is like a good night of sleep. Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going to wake him up. That may be the most powerful sentence metaphor on death in the entire Bible. That we fall asleep and Jesus comes and wakes us up. Yeah? Another reason I think this is really good news is because it demonstrates that core word of the gospel we talked about a few weeks ago. If you were here, do you remember the one word that best describes the gospel? Together. My wife remembers. Thank you, Kim. Together. Together is the one word that best describes the good news. Jesus died to bring us together with God and together with one another. And this form of, this understanding of what happens when we die illustrates again God's value of the word together. Rather than have us kind of straggle into heaven one after another after we die and waiting for the people that we love to kind of die too so that they can join us, if death really is like a sleep, that what that means is that someday is coming when Jesus comes again and the trumpet is going to blast and his voice is going to speak and we will all resurrect together. And we will all see Jesus for the first time together. And that we will all meet him in the air together, and that we will all experience heaven for the very first time together. This may be a new concept for you, but according to Jesus, we all sleep until that day. And the day when he comes again, And then we'll be woken up together. And if you were able to experience all of this, Jesus and heaven and the banquet table, all of that for the first time together with the people that you love and the people that you've done life with, wouldn't that be a beautiful thing? Now, if this isn't what you grew up believing or came in here today believing, now this can instantly raise questions and concerns, and I get this. You know, chances are you have been comforted in the past by the belief that someone that you love who has died is right now in heaven. And when you hear that Jesus is teaching that death is like sleep, you have concerns, and maybe you think about nights when you haven't slept well and you've tossed and turned and the night has been so long, and then we kind of equate that to this metaphor and we think, well, what's happening to the person that I love that has died? Are they tossing and turning? Are they experiencing time passing? Are they experiencing pain? Are they experiencing impatience or whatever? What is it like? Well, it's clear that the sleep of death is so deep that there is no experience of time passing. And what that means is whether we die 4 days before Jesus comes again or 4,000 years before Jesus comes again, it will seem like an instant to us. And so we don't have to worry about our loved ones experiencing, again, loneliness or boredom or fear or pain because there's no passing of time in the grave. So in practical terms, we do believe that the very next thing we experience after death is heaven, is seeing Jesus. And we will experience it together. So the first thing that Jesus taught about death is that it is like a state of sleeping. And as we return to our story, we find that Jesus and his disciples, they come down, they finally, after they waited 2 days, they come down from the north, they get to Bethany, and they arrive. And what they find is that Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. This was a time of intense grief for the family. These two sisters, Mary and Martha, Lazarus was their only source of income. Women couldn't earn money on their own. So, I mean, this is devastating on so many levels for them. And so they're in deep grief. They have questions. They're surrounded by friends and family who have come from Jerusalem to grieve with them. And Martha, one of the sisters, hears that Jesus is coming. He hasn't come into the house yet, but she gets up, she leaves, and she goes out and meets Jesus. And we kind of pick up where these two begin to discuss. It says, "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" Now, this is one of the most interesting interactions at a funeral that I've been to a lot of funerals. I've seen a lot of things, and this is one that I kind of cringe a little bit. It starts with, and I'll go back, with Martha asking Jesus a really hard question, and you can kind of hear the jab in it. If you had been here, my brother would not have died. In other words, this is your fault. She's asking Jesus, not really asking a question, but making a statement that's putting the blame on Jesus, and it's pretty hard. She's saying, "Jesus, where were you? We sent for you. If you had come when we asked you, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be grieving. My brother wouldn't be dead. My future wouldn't look hopeless. Why didn't you come?" And have you ever been there in a state of grief or intense loss? And you're asking God these same questions. Where were you? Why didn't you answer me when I called? I asked you for help. I asked you for healing. I asked you to come through, and you didn't come through. If you had come through, this wouldn't have happened. These are great questions. These are ultimate questions. And as Craig mentioned in the video, these are questions that we need to ask. God can handle it. Jesus can handle it. But Jesus says to Martha, you got to remember, these are the very first words out of his mouth to this woman who just lost her brother. She's in deep grief, and he says, "Your brother will rise again." Now again, I've had a bit of experience and training on how to walk with people through grief. And, the one thing you're supposed to not do is try to take away their pain with your words, right? You should be there. You should empathize. If I were coaching Jesus here, I was like, Jesus, no, 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 no. Let her be in her pain for a while. Empathize with her. I'm so sorry for your loss, Martha. I'm sorry I didn't make it in time, Martha. I understand your pain. I understand your questions. But Jesus does none of that. And I guess if you have the power to raise the dead at the funeral, you could say whatever you want. Your brother will rise again. Now listen to what Martha says. I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Listen to what Martha's not saying. She's not saying, I know that he's in heaven now and that he's happy and that everything's going to be good, right? She doesn't say that. She knows what Jesus has taught about death and that it's more like a sleep. She had listened to his teaching, like times when he had said earlier in the book of John, where he said, a time is coming in the future when all who are in their graves will hear his voice and come out. Speaking of resurrection day, when Jesus comes again, the trumpet blasts, and Jesus speaks the word, right? Those who have done good will rise to live, and those who have done evil will rise to be condemned. She knew these things right from the mouth of Jesus, but this is where Jesus issues his most powerful, most important teaching on death. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? That's a pretty amazing thing to say. I am the resurrection, and I am the life. Audacious. But what Jesus is saying is that death and resurrection, it's not a belief as much as a person. Jesus is saying, I am the source of resurrection. I am the source of life. He is the one who in the beginning spoke the word and the world was created. I mean, just think of the power in that word. And he will have no trouble resurrecting and giving life to any number of people, no matter what happened to them or how they died or what happened to their body or how long they've been in the grave, because he is the resurrection and the life. He then goes on to clarify how we receive this life and this resurrection, where he says, he who believes in me will live even though he dies. Anyone who puts their faith in him, Jesus is saying, even though you die, even though someone you love dies, and it will appear as though death has won and that it is permanent, if you believe in me, that is not the end. Because even though you die, you will live again. This is an amazing truth. Just believe in Jesus. Trust Jesus in the face of tragedy and loss and pain and questions. And he will make things right again. And these are more than words. I mean, this is something that he is going to, just in a few moments, back up with evidence, with proof. Well, Martha ends up going back into the house, and she finds her sister Mary, and she tells Mary Jesus is here. So Mary now leaves the gathering and goes out to have a private moment with Jesus. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Demonstrating how universal this question is when grief comes. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him. Those two words, Jesus wept, I think are such incredibly good news. You may be like, why is Jesus crying good news? Jesus crying lets us see his humanity. Jesus crying lets us see how much he loved Lazarus. I mean, Jesus crying demonstrates just his empathy and his care and his tenderness. It tells us that when we weep, Jesus weeps. But more than anything else, I think Jesus weeping tells us that death was never a part of his plan. Jesus stands there and he's looking at this tomb that contains the body of his very good friend, a man that he loved. And he looks around him and he sees the pain of all the people who loved Lazarus and everything that they're going through and everything they're experiencing and all of their questions. And he thinks, this was never supposed to be. This was not according to the plan. When I created the world, I intended for people to be able to live forever, to never experience this kind of loss. And I am confident that today, Jesus is weeping with the King family. Jesus is weeping with those of us at Newday. This was never a part of his plan. So contrary to what many believe, the Bible makes it clear that God does not always get his way. Everything that happens is not like because God wanted it. God's will is not always done. This is so important because this world is filled with tragic loss. Children dying far too young. A whole family wiped out by a drunk driver. Hundreds of people losing their lives in a moment because of a terrorist. And we say things like, well, God has a plan. Sure, God has a plan, but that was not a part of it. Or God, took them and he knows what he's doing. Really? God took them? I'm not as confident that God took them. Death wasn't a part of his plan. God doesn't always get his way. His will isn't always done. Not in the short term, anyway. God does have a plan. And he is working to restore all things. And he will bring beauty from the ashes. He is the resurrection and the life, and everyone who believes in him will live even though they die. That is his plan. We continue on. Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." So Jesus is having a conversation with his Father. He's praying out loud, not for their sake, but for the sake of the people around them. He's saying it for their sake, so that they will believe about what just is about to happen. When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Wow. What can you say to that other than, wow, would you not have liked to have been at that funeral to experience that? I mean, just consider the power of the Word of God. Again, the Bible tells us that Jesus is the one. He is the agency through which all things were created and that he created through his words. Only his words. He said universe, and the universe and all of its complexity came into being. Stars, he knew them all. They just came into being by the power of his word. He said giraffe and whale and zebra, man, woman, they came into being at the power of his word. The word is so powerful. And when he speaks those words, Lazarus, come out. Something begins to happen inside of that tomb that is beyond our ability to comprehend. But there is a stirring. And Lazarus, who had been under decay for 4 days, the decay is reversed. And all of his memory and all of his personalities are returned to him. And the spark of life returns. And Lazarus wakes up wondering what happened. He didn't realize 4 days had passed. All he knows is that he is alive again and wonders why he is wrapped up in grave clothes. And he walks out of a cave and he wonders why everyone is crying. Let's go back. You remember the first important thing we said we need to kind of remember? When Jesus said, "The sickness will not end in death." And it didn't end in death, right? The result of the sickness was death, but the end was resurrection. It did not end in death. I remember studying this passage with some friends who had never heard the story before. Just imagine, this is so awesome, right? And so we're reading through the story, and we got to the part where Lazarus dies, and they all stopped, and they called foul. Wait a minute! Jesus, they recognized, Jesus said that this sickness will not end in death. I said, oh, just finish the story. Finish the story. And they got to the end of the story, and they're like, oh, they're able to put it together. Yeah, it didn't end in death. The result was death, but the end was resurrection. And that is the same. The same is true for us with ourselves, with our loved ones. The end is not death. Death may be a result of this or that, but the end, or shall we say the beginning, is resurrection. What's the other thing that we remembered? We remember when Jesus said he stayed where he was for 2 more days. Now, this just raises lots of questions. I've never heard really good answers. Maybe you have an answer to this. We could talk after the service. Why, Jesus, did he wait for 2 more days? I've got some possible ideas, but we don't know for sure. And this just kind of raises the mystery of God's timing. It doesn't always make sense to us. We don't know why he waited for 2 days to leave, but he did, and he probably had a reason for it. And we may struggle with God's timing just the way Mary and Martha did. Why? Why didn't you answer it when I needed you to? Why are you waiting? But what he said to his disciples, he says to every one of us, your sickness does not have to end in death. The sickness of your loved ones does not have to end in death, because death isn't the end. It is simply a period of sleep until he comes again, speaks your name, and resurrects you. We may not understand his timing. We may not understand why he didn't do something before death, but it won't end in death. It ends in resurrection. What we see as we finish this passage in John chapter 11 is that Jesus resurrecting Lazarus is what would eventually result in Jesus himself being crucified. Less than a week later, Jesus will be hanging on a cross after going through a mock trial and being convicted and being flogged and then being nailed to a cross. And then ultimately he would resurrect again. Why? Because many of those who witnessed this resurrection of Lazarus went back to Jerusalem, told the religious leaders what had happened, and then they had a meeting. Because apparently that's what you do when someone raises someone from the dead at a funeral. You have a meeting. And they all got together and they said, we cannot allow this to continue, because if this continues, everyone will believe in him, and that's not acceptable. And so within a week, Jesus is hanging on a cross, dying a slow, agonizing death. But 3 days later, he rose from the grave, forever conquering the death and removing its sting forever. And by rising from the grave, by conquering death, Jesus has proven that he has the authority to say the audacious things he said, like, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even though they die. If this truth doesn't make a difference in how you live your life, if this belief doesn't make a difference in what you do when loss comes and how you process that, I don't know what will. If this isn't a relevant truth or belief, I don't know what is. Jesus has overcome. The grave is overwhelmed. The victory is won. He has risen from the grave. So ultimately, we have no need to fear. Ultimately, we have no need to lose hope, because he will grant eternal life to everyone who simply believes in him. So as the worship team comes up, I just want to ask you, what are you doing with this belief? More importantly, what are you doing with this man? Have you placed your faith in him? Do you trust him enough to trust him with your death and your resurrection? And if you do, I want to encourage you to respond to him today, just through the words of a song we're about to sing. And it may be the first time that you actually sing words like this with faith, or maybe the 1,000th time that you sing it. But I just want to encourage you to sing these words with faith, that I will rise when he calls my name. No more sorrow, no more pain. I will rise on eagle's wings before my God. Fall on my knees, I will rise. Our Father and our God, in the midst of loss and unanswered questions and pain, we have nowhere else to turn but to you. We want to thank you that we can come to you and praise you for your goodness, even when it hurts. We want to thank you that you, Jesus, died in our place and rose again so that you can make claims like you are the resurrection and the life. We just want to pray that every person in this room, every person in earshot would trust you with their resurrection. That we would believe you, that when we face death, the death of the people that we love and our own mortality, we would face it with courage, boldness, and faith. Not because of what we have done, but because of what you have done and what you will do. Thank you. We pray this in your name, Jesus.